because my mum committed suicide and your mum committed suicide, but the extra sort of layer to the whole story is that both of those women were sisters.
My mum's attempted this as a cry for help multiple times throughout her whole life.
I was going to people's houses, I'd be crying and that, but then I would just sleep. I say falling asleep, but I wonder if it was just passing out.
Although my mum wasn't capable of being what other people would call a good mother, she was a good mum.
It was just fucking too much to take. Do you know what I mean? With what you were saying, with the fact that she'd set fire to herself.
I can't imagine the place that she must have been in.
Any memory I've got of my mum feels like it's a chapter or part of a chapter or a story that I know leads up to a really tragic ending.
The ending's the same and the beginning's the same. It's just the middle that's slightly different.
So we're going to do this because my mum committed suicide and your mum committed suicide, but the extra sort of layer to the whole story is that both of those women were sisters, and they were the only two women out of a family of 6, which I think is quite telling. Do you know what I mean?
It's very telling. Yeah.
It's very telling that the two girls, both really similar lives, really similar sort of behavioural patterns, and then both sort of ended their lives prematurely by their own choice, and left a whole heap of mess behind. For me personally, we'll get onto that with you, but we're first cousins, which people can obviously tell because we're so identical looking.
There is a family trait, you can see in us.
Is there? I don't know, I've never seen it. But yeah, we're first cousins. Like I said, they were 2 sisters out of a family of 6, 4 boys, 2 girls. We'll get this out of the way. I've been having some pretty serious conversations with a couple of family members whose opinion I respect, basically, and there's only really a few of those in our family, but I was having some conversations, and what I took out of that is that I'm very aware that out of that family of 6, including our mothers, as much as they spoke to each other, nobody's close to each other at all out of the siblings. None of those siblings have held any kind of, they meet up occasionally as the years rolled on. I know that a couple of the brothers would meet up here and there, but they've never maintained a relationship. They've never kept in touch. There's been no real closeness in that generation's family. We don't want to air too much about that generation's issues when they were younger, but I've said it before in podcasts, so it's not something I'm saying that's new. That generation had a childhood that was as bad as you could possibly imagine, and it doesn't take a genius to work out what would make a childhood so bad. No real close relationships maintained over the years, including our mothers, who were, they spoke to each other, they would meet up, but just...
I think that one might be slightly misunderstood, because as much as I think you're right in what you're saying, there were moments when they were, I'd say, secretly close, as in the rest of the family didn't quite realize how close they were, because they did speak regularly on the phone, and my mum did go and visit. But
like we're saying, we are talking about the fact that they both committed suicide. So I suppose the first thing is how old your mother took her life first.
She went first, but so she would have been
after? Yeah.
No, I think she was 37, so I would have been 17.
Right. So my mum was 42. I'm older than you anyway, but my mum was 42 and I was 24. How did you find out? How did it happen? Where were you, etc.? If you don't mind me asking those. I'll explain my bit as well, because I remember it all clearly.
I will tell you how I remember it now. That doesn't mean to say that it's actual facts now, because, like other people, I have a tendency to not remember clearly a lot of the history. So I would have been 17 and I wasn't living at my mum's at that point, because we had some difficult issues and I'd already moved out about a year before. So I was living with my friend and her mum, and I was going to go and see her one day, and I decided not to. I don't know why. I just decided I wasn't going to go. And then the next day I was taken to the doctors because I had an appointment at the doctors. So my friend's mum took me to the doctors, which was where I lived with my mum, and they told me So I didn't know for nearly 24 hours, which causes a whole other issue, because a whole lot of member of the family in our family did know. And this is where the anger comes from, because I know that lots of people knew while I did not know. And there were members of the friendship circle that knew where I was staying, knew the person I was living with, and didn't mention anything even to them. Not that I expect them to tell me, but they could have told this adult that could have then, told me, but they didn't anyway. The doctors told me 24 hours after.
It's a bit of a similar, sort of.
There was I didn't even know that was even there.
There was a desperate attempt to find out where I was, but because of my lifestyle back then, people knew that I could be anywhere, and I know that
you could have been anywhere.
Yeah. So I know that people were ringing around. People were trying to get in touch with the police. They got through to South Shields Police, my uncle, and he said that South Shields Police just said, listen, we've got about 13 addresses for this lad. Like, he could be anywhere in the Tyneside region. I was on my way to a birthday party. I was with one of my friends, and we was all walking towards a birthday party. And I got a phone call off somebody that should never have been calling me. There was no reason for this person to call me. It was a friend of mine. He rung me, and I remember just thinking, well, why are you ringing me? I have to not get upset when I do this. So he rung me, and he was like, have you spoke to your uncle? And I was like, what? And he was like, have you spoke to your uncle? You need to speak to your uncle. And I was like, what for? And he went, oh, I don't know, mate. And I was like, all right. And I put the phone down. And then all of a sudden it started dawning on me that Ashley had rung me. And I was like, well, why is he ringing me to speak to my uncle? And I couldn't get in touch with anybody. And then I rung him back. And I was like, I just knew. Do you know what it is? Like, I rung him back. And before I rung him back, I looked at my friends that I was with. And they was like, what's wrong? Because they saw my face just go really solemn. And I just looked at them and said, my mum's dead. And they were like, what? Because it just seemed so bizarre for them to me to be on the phone. I put the phone, and I just said, my mum's dead. And they were like, what you get? And I rung Ashley. And I just said, just tell me. And he was like, what? And I was like, I know what you're going to say. Just tell me. And he told me. And then in true Ricky Gleason fashion, I put the phone down and I went absolutely fucking mental in the street. And I was kicking mirrors off doors and stuff, and off car doors. And all my mates were trying to sort of subdue me. It was all my student mates. So they were nothing, it was the people that I'd met in Africa that were all gap year. There was all in university in Newcastle. They were posh, for want of a better phrase, and they didn't know what was going on. And it's mad how I remember everything though. Some woman came to her door. This was in Jesmond area of Newcastle, which is a really nice area, and some woman came to her door, but you could see that there was something wrong. This wasn't just somebody behaving like a dickhead for no reason. There was clearly something wrong. And this woman was asking what had happened, and she heard me saying, I need a cigarette. I smoked back then. She was like, I was saying I need a cigarette, and she went and bought me 10 cigarettes from the shop and everything. And my mates, bless him, he cancelled his birthday party. He walked in and just said, I can't come to my own party. His name was Paddy. Like, he walked in and just said, I can't come to my own party. Like, Ricky's just found out that his mum. And then really, really randomly, from absolutely nowhere, I remembered my uncle's number, and I rung him up, and then he told me the rest. That she took her own life. Like 48 hours it had taken to get in touch with me. And then I was just like, how did she do it? He told me mine was very dramatic. She'd set fire to herself, which was probably not the greatest thing to hear.
I mean, you had that a lot more difficult
as the years roll on. I think that it becomes unimportant in how it happened. You know what I mean? It's just the fact
to you. But when you retell the story to other people, you'll get the same shock every time.
It's a shocking thing to hear, isn't it? Do you know what I mean?
To you, you've normalized it. It is what it is. We haven't dealt with it, but it is what it is. But other people,
how did your mother do it? I've never known really anything about it. Nobody ever spoke to me about it.
The same. Well, for her, the difference between her and your mum is that, and I don't know whether your mum's done this before, but my mum's attempted this as a cry for help multiple times throughout her whole life at different stages, because my mum suffered with lots of other issues. So she took tablets and she took alcohol, but whether she meant for it to go quite as far as it did, I don't think she did. I think that's the difference, because usually there's a phone call made and the help comes in time. unfortunately the help didn't come in time. So this ended in the only
She leave a note? Anything?
No, because that's the point. You know, when there's a cry for help, sometimes like this, as historically has happened with her before, is she would make a phone call to whoever, you know, and they would turn up, and then they would call the ambulance, blah, 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 whatever. There'd always be somebody around nearby that would effectively be able to, you know, assist. But in this particular case, in this set of circumstances, she was found with the phone by her, you know, the landline back then. She was found with all the things that would require her to do it. But what she had done is we had a neighbor that lived upstairs that was on extremely strong, I don't know, sleeping tablets, antidepressants, whatever they might have been. She'd been collecting them over a period of time. So some people might say that she had planned it. And in some respects she did, because it was, in my opinion, a cry for help. However, the circumstances around the way in which she was found indicated that she may well have tried to have made a call to help. But then that could just be me justifying the fact that I don't want to admit that my mum committed suicide. But there you go.
Yeah.
That's what happened. But, you know, little too late. It was always going to happen that way. I knew that. Mark knew that. You know, it was only a matter of time before she eventually passed over.
How did you cope? Like, initially, how did you react? Like, what was the crack? Did you, because like I said,
because I found anger, because obviously I found out at the doctors. So the first thing I tried to do was go to my mum's house to find out, which I couldn't then, because at this point, simultaneously as me going there, the police were there. It'd been cordoned off, because not only had she been found in what they considered to be suspicious circumstances, it was now, you know, my brother had been questioned. Some other people that I can't mention had been, you know, questioned, all innocent, you know, nothing related whatsoever.
Did you know they was innocent as well?
Oh, of course. Yeah, everybody did. I don't even know why, but, you know, based on the area that we lived in and the circumstances at the time and the type of life and stuff that had been going on before and a whole lot of other factors, I think it was just a course of nature that these, you know, these things had to happen. So they happened, which was what made me angry, because the point is if my brother had been arrested and certain other people, or not arrested, questioned, you know, and certain other people had been questioned, everybody knew where I was, including the police. You know, the police knew where I was, family members knew where I was, friends of family members knew where I was. I wasn't far away. I was still in the Slough area. I was about 20 minutes away, you know, by car, if that. Yeah. Somebody could have mentioned to me, it did not need to take 24 hours for me to find out from the doctors by accident, you know. So that's where my anger came from originally. And then I sat with that for quite a long time. It took me a long time to just let it go.
Eventually, no, you know, I can honestly say people were desperate to find me. You know, people in South.
This was find you. It's like people are desperate to try and find you, but because you'd moved so many times, you could understand.
Well, this, you know, my lifestyle back then was very nomadic. You know, I didn't have any. I didn't have a set address. I'd migrated from South Shields to, I was living up in Newcastle, and I hung around with students, and it was a good period of my life until that point, to be honest. I was in a pretty good place. And I know that there was a very probably legitimate concern that one of our uncles was living with my mum at the time, and there was a bit of a concern that I was going to blame him and try and kill him, I think is what one of our cousins said. He was like, you've got to get so-and-so out there, Ricky's going to kill him and that. But that was never actually the case. I never blamed anyone, even though the person I'm talking about that was living there, I've got very little respect for as a human being. There was never any blame towards anybody for me. You know, and it took a long time to tell me because of the way that I lived. And like I said, I lost my temper originally, and then I kept falling asleep. That's what I put, because I've got down in the notes what were initial coping mechanisms and how I reacted, and I kept falling asleep everywhere. That's one thing I do remember. If I was going to people's houses, you know, like, I'd be crying and that, but then I would just sleep. I say falling asleep, but I wonder if it was just passing out, collapsing, if you know what I mean, fainting almost.
It's probably just a method of blocking it out, isn't it? In a safe space. I mean, you probably didn't have many safe spaces, so when you found one, your body took it.
What about your other family? Because obviously you've got a brother. I'm an only child, so it was just me, but you've got a brother. So how was that?
Well, I mean, obviously I can't speak for him specifically.
What I mean is, did you
did you instantly think that you had to look after Mark?
Yeah, even now. I mean, I'm 42 and he's 40, but that isn't just because my mum passed. Because of events in our past, I've always been the not like an additional parent figure, so I parent him, so I parented him, not in a just looked after and protected him, that was what I did. And then that's what happened, tried to do even more. But it's difficult when you're 17 to figure out what it is you've got to do now, because suddenly, you've got a house, and you've got to work, and you've got to pay bills that you've never had to figure out any of those things before, because it came prematurely. So had to figure that out while Mark was safe. That was the difference. Mark was safe. He had two safe havens. He had one of the uncles' family. He was safe there, so he had that to go to, and he valued that. So I knew that was okay. And he also had his friends, his circle of friends, and the family that he lived with there. So he was safe and he was cared for. So it was just a case of the next few years' survival, which Do you know what I've always wanted to know? I've always wanted to know, like, how, like, you've always had your shit together.
I haven't had my shit together.
I know that, like, I know you might.
I have.
Yeah, well, I know you might now say, "Oh no, I haven't emotionally, like, I haven't blah blah." But just in general, like, bearing in mind, like, the background's quite similar to mine, and like the household that you grew up with probably wasn't the best. But you've always seemed to, like, be the opposite of me, in that I've never really, like, had my shit together with paying bills, holding down a job, until I joined the Navy.
I didn't. I think there are two differences. I think my characteristic as a person is different to my mum. I'm the complete opposite. We have a lot of similarities, but I'm the complete opposite to her in many ways. And I know that although my mum wasn't capable of being what other people would call a good mother, she was a good mum. She protected us to the best of her ability, even though sometimes we were in situations that were not right. She loved us and did the best for us. So I knew that I knew that she was coming from a good place, and I knew at an early age she just didn't know how to do it. She just didn't know how to do it. And I learned.
Sorry. We both know that the example they got for motherhood was amongst the very fucking worst that there could be.
But don't forget, I do have, me and Mark, we do have another side. We do have our dad's side, and that wasn't rich in monetary value at all. They were equally, as working class as anyone else, but their values were a lot different. So there was a very stability side available to us to see. So we knew, it might have only been in summer holidays at times, it might have only been at Christmas, but we knew that there was another side. We knew that there was a different way of living, and that it didn't have to be like that.
Yeah, I think it was you that pointed out to me that I think you realized quite early on that I was on my own. Like, I was out there.
That's it. I was able to take my, even early, if you're talking to, like, really young ages, I took looking after Mark to be my source of processing things. So the difficult, so as we went through things, I took to Mark, or I went to work, or I changed my focus. I knew that I didn't want to be like my mum. I love my mum, but I didn't want to be like my mum. I wanted to be the opposite. Whereas Mark, on the other hand, has more of her family traits, if you like.
Yeah, I don't really know where I fit on that. I don't really know where I fit. I don't think that I'm like my mum.
You're not like your mum, but I think you inherited family traits.
I copied a lot of behaviours, as in,
in your early days, you would have took the drink, didn't you? You chose.
Well, you say early days. I've only not been drinking for less than what we on.
And I would say that was a family trait. If I look back on most of the family members that I know on my mum's side, they've all had a fondness for alcohol.
Well, mine was drugs as well. In fact, mine were drugs first. You know, I took an immense amount of drugs, and I started taking drugs really early. I started taking drugs when I was 13. I started solvents, 13, and then just progressed through the drugs. And I'm always really honest about this. Don't think that it was all bad. There was a period of time where those drugs were party drugs, and I was out partying very hard and having a good. It was always to excess, and in the long run, very sort of negative. There were negative repercussions to the, why can't I say that word? Repercussions to the way that I was using drugs, but it wasn't just like crack and heroin all the time. There was a lot of party drugs and a lot of nights out and a lot of raves and, you know, a lot of hedonism.
Well, that's how you would have been dealing with your stuff. You dealt with it in that manner, whereas me and Mark dealt with it with abstaining completely, you know, anti, you know, all of that, with the exception of when we went out drinking. When we did go out drinking, it'd be binge drinking, which is neither healthy either.
No, but look, I would say that binge drinking is a massive part of just British culture. A lot of people, we go out and we get smashed.
What I've had to do, so now only in the last 2 years have I realised I've had to, as opposed to say, you know, yourself that had issues with drinking, I had the reverse. I was so anti-drinking that I wouldn't tolerate drinking in my house. You know, like my partner couldn't drink. You couldn't have a summer drink in my garden. You couldn't have a wine. I was so anti it. Whereas now I have a healthier relationship with alcohol now. I'm not a big drinker, but I can now drink, you know, a shandy in the garden or a fruit flavored cider in the garden. So it's like we're the reverse. You know,
have you ever drunk? Have you ever been drunk? Have you ever?
Of course, I've been drunk. You know, I do get drunk.
I've met people that are like, nah.
Just not many people. Not many people of my family would have seen it. For instance, my dad's side of the family, no, they've never seen it. And maybe only a handful of times in the last few years.
I seem to have a really good memory in like you were just saying there, our other cousin Andy, you won't mind me naming him, he was saying that, and again, he the timeline for things, he just forget, everything morphs into the past for him. So when we were talking about my mum recently, I was listening to him talking and I was thinking, do you think I was a little kid when this happened? And I said to him, how old do you think I was when this happened? And he went, I don't know, you was like 14 or something, weren't you? And I was like, I was 24, Andy. I came to stay with you afterwards. Like, we were grown-ups, do you know what I mean? And he was saying he just seems to be able to just forget about things and they go into the background. I don't know whether that's in the long run healthy or unhealthy, because that's kind of suppressing it. Whereas I've got a really vivid, even my childhood, I can piece together where stuff was happening. I haven't forgot anything, you know, all the bad stuff growing up. I've got vivid memories of it, you know, and I can still remember just how it was just fucking too much to take. Do you know what I mean? With what you were saying, with the fact that she'd set fire to herself. I can remember clearly I ended up with just this mantra almost, where all day long, in my head, all that was going round and round and round was the speaking to myself in my head, my mum's killed herself, my mum's killed herself, my mum's killed herself.
But you had no siblings to work with that with. You had to do that. That's the thing. You had to do that on your own, more or less.
Yeah, well, I went back down to Slough, even though Andy forgot. I went back down to Slough. He picked me up from the train station. I remember I got off the train and he just looked at me and was like, pint? And I was like, yeah, I think so. We went for a pint, and that was the closest I got to it. The fact that, you know, I was very, very close to Andy's dad, Jeff. I was very close to Jeff, and he obviously got me down there. Me and Andy have always been close. Me and Louise close. But you're right. It's not, you know, I was still on my own. I was still, those feelings, I still had to just walk around with those feelings to myself. It was in my head. It's my head that I have to walk around with. And that's something that as I've got older, I contend with constant self-narration in my head. And I think that's why I drunk so much growing up, is to silence the fact that I never get any peace and quiet. You had Mark to talk to. Did you just talk a lot?
No, not really. No? Because his version and my version differ slightly, because obviously he was he'd have been just 15. So, and he was going through a different situation to what I was going through. So it's only in the last few years, I think, that we've really probably on and off spoke about it. Like in bits, we didn't really speak too much because we just survived. I think that's what we did. We just survived. He blocked out. So he blocked it out, which I think is quite a male thing to do in that situation, especially when you're young and you've got a load of other things going on. Whereas I think I just worked. I don't know really how you process these things. You just do.
Did you because I always used to get people to be like, my mum's name had come, people would ask about my parents and I'd say, my mum's passed away.
That was the difficult bit. Yeah. Even now, that's the difficult bit.
People to be like, oh, how did it happen? And I'd think, fuck off, mate. Don't fucking ask me that. Do you know what I mean?
You know, it's not, I don't mind saying it. It's not me that has a problem, but I know I can see the reaction on the other side.
Well, yeah, for a while I had a problem with it, but then exactly what you said, it would almost be like, I don't want to say it to make you feel as uncomfortable as I know you're going to feel when I tell you. Do you know what I mean? But yeah, I didn't, you know what? I didn't talk about it to anyone pretty much I worked out about 17 years. I'd been in the Navy for 9 years before I told my best mate in the Navy what had happened. He knew that my mum wasn't alive, but it was just one of them. It was almost like people could work out wasn't something I was going to talk about. Do you know what I mean? I would just, a lot of the time I would just say, oh, she was ill. She was ill for quite a while. And actually that was me saying to myself that she died of alcoholism, because I always say that.
So you changed the narrative slightly to suit.
In my head, she died of alcoholism. Do you know what I mean? And I still say it was alcohol.
To be honest, it probably was, because it was the alcohol that made her kind of feel and do the things that she ended up doing. I mean, I can't imagine the place that she must have been in.
By the end, my mum was drinking a bottle of vodka a day minimum.
Wow.
She was barricading herself in her room, while the person that I was talking about, the uncle that I don't really respect very much at all, he somehow ended up living in the house that I'd grown up in while I was all over the place, and he was sitting downstairs watching the TV while she was barricading herself in her room and drinking herself unconscious, waking up drinking unconscious.
So my mum died before your mum died. So did my mum's death have a big impact on your mum, would you think?
Yeah, I don't think it affected her in the sense that it made her suicidal or anything. I just saw it, and I was coming to that age where I was piecing things together and thinking, actually, I'm not the bad person, because obviously I'd been told that I would tear away and I was really badly behaved and I was a terrible person and stuff, and I hadn't made it through school because of my behavior and stuff. And I was just coming to the age where I was thinking, I've got a feeling I know why I've turned out like this. Do you know what I mean? And I
suddenly dawned on you.
I think it might be you lot. Do you know?
No way.
I was just coming to that age where I was sort of getting to grips with it all, and I said to her, like, I know this is coming. And funnily enough, I was meant to go. I wasn't meant to go and see my mum. I think I'd forgot Mother's Day. When's Mother's Day? I forgot something, and then rung her a couple of days later and apologized, and I hadn't gone to see her about something.
Yeah, but there's always like a reason. I mean, if she was in you can never know the answer to any of those things, but she wouldn't have necessarily been in a good place when you went, which may have meant that if you weren't in a good place and you're both not in good places, it's just you feel guilty for stuff that your parents did.
I'll be honest, I don't really feel that guilty. I don't think that and I was writing this down in my notes. One of the things that I regret, and this might sound harsh, is I regret that I didn't chin off the relationship with my mum earlier on, and I wish that I didn't stop forgiving her for some of the stupid things that she was doing, because after I'd left home and I'd calmed down, it was her that was causing me problems, and I was really aware of it. I was going round to visit her and ended up in huge arguments with her because she was mortal drunk. Do you know what I mean? And I was walking off like crying my eyes out about stuff in my like mid-20s, and it got to the stage where it's like, well, actually, there's part of me that a few things happened in my late teens where I would have had every right to say, this is the end of our relationship until you sort your shit out. And I sometimes wonder if that would have been a better thing to do, to sort of maybe bring her to her senses instead of keep forgiving her and keep going back, because we had a real love-hate relationship, me and my mum. We always forgave each other.
I did have all these other aspects, if you know what I mean. Like I did go to clubs, and we did go to we did do things together. She did take us on like little holidays, and we did do these normal things sometimes. It's just that they weren't as often or as frequent or as not, as everybody else. So I could see that. So my mum would be looking at other people and seeing what other people were doing, she would try when she was in a good mindset. And that's the difference with her mental health, was that if she was in a good mindset, she'd be able to do these normal everyday parent things. But then when she was in a bad mindset, she wouldn't be able to do those. And then the older she got, the more into the bad mindset she was, the less of the normal we got, if you know what I mean.
How's it affected your memory of your mum? Memories. So how's it affected your memories?
I mean, I've gone through moments of anger and frustration and denial and all those things. Now I know exactly who my mum was and what she was. She wasn't perfect by any means, but my memories are not that clear anymore. So I just I don't know really how to answer your question.
I now, after that happened, I can never look back at any of my memories of anything that even the good times when I've got, like, you know, we went on a trip or anything. Anytime I think about it, any memory I've got of my mum feels like it's a chapter or part of a chapter or a story that I know leads up to a really tragic ending. So I tend not to think about it. I'd be able to say that I've got no good memories of my mother. I never look back at any fondness ever at any point of my life that involves my mum. I got rid of all photos after it happened. Passport, everything. I didn't look at a picture of my mum for about 14 years, something like that, before I started looking at pictures.
Yeah. I struggle to look at my mum's picture. I have good memories, have lots of little good memories, but they are all tinged with sadness, because as much as they were good, you know that surrounding them was not good stuff, because, you know, as with our lives, you know, our parents, that, you know, 10 days or whatever of good, you know, good ups could result in the equal amount of downs. So, you know, but that doesn't mean I don't have good memories. I do. I just know that, you know, if I think about them for too long, I'll end up venturing into the other side. So I don't really. But there are moments in my life, you know, where I wish that, you know, I do wake up and think, or something will happen, and I just think, oh, I wish my mum was here. I wish, you know, I wish I could say this. But then equally, on the other hand, you know, I don't know how you're going to take this, but what she did was probably the kindest thing she could do for us, because she did it for us at an age when I was 17, before we'd even started the rest of our adult life. So we were able to carry on as we are now. If she had have stayed alive, it wouldn't have been any better than where you would have gone through, because the alcohol would have just been worse. The mental health would have just been worse. I would have grown into a 20-something. I would have been, you know, angry still, you know, going through all those emotions, fighting with her equally as you did, probably to have the same outcome, just maybe years down the line where I'm more damaged.
I know that what really annoyed me is that I was in the process of sorting my life out. Do you know what I mean? I was on a
That's what I mean, because of the age gaps, you know, because I was 17 when it happened. I hadn't started, whereas you had already, you know, you were in your 20s, so you were trying to get your life.
I was 24. I was 24. I'd come off probation, kind of thing. I hadn't been arrested for years. I'd stopped getting into trouble.
You was in a good place, trying to go
started
forward.
working. I wouldn't say I was in a good, but I'd started working. I was just at the beginning of finally getting to grips with life and sorting myself out, and it was a massive setback.
And then
you know what I mean? It was like, you know, and I remember being really pissed off, like really, really pissed off. Like it was almost like you can't, even when I'm sorting my shit out, you still manage to do something to fuck it up for me. Do you know what I mean? What's annoying, right, is that because she did that, because she isn't around now, because as I've got older, I look back and realize what was going on and why I ended up the way I ended up in my teens. I haven't got the opportunity to hold her to account for it. There's a massive part of me that would love to be able to sit her down and say, do you accept responsibility for this, that, and this? Do you know what I mean? So I carry that. I have to carry the fact that I haven't got that opportunity.
I understand what you mean, because I have those similar feelings towards our mum's mother. However, what I realized in one of those conversations with her was that you can never hold these people accountable. No, now, like, your mum was never going to be in a position to be held accountable because she didn't understand what she was doing. She didn't realize she didn't have the capacity to realize the damage she was inflicting on you. You know, love was never a question, but her ability to do the things she needed to do as a mother was. So you going to her now and saying to her this, she wouldn't have recognized it. And so in some ways, her exit in this world has done you a kindness, potentially.
I will say
that's how I see it with my mum. She's done me a kindness.
I will say the last time I saw my mum was but this shows where she was in, you know, her attitude towards life. We met up and I took her for lunch in Jesmond, which is a nice part of Newcastle, and we went around Jesmond Dean, which is this lovely big park. And this is like, you know, a 15-minute, 25-minute metro journey from where she was living in South Shields. And I remember we went around this park, and then I took her up Osborne Road, which is a swanky bit of Jesmond, you know, it's where all the bars and all the restaurants are. And I remember saying, I never realised there were places like this around here. And I was like, you've lived your whole life in this dumpy little fucking town called South Shields. Because South Shields, look, I grew up there. It's my hometown, really. But, you know, it's people that live in South Shields will tell you it's not the greatest place in the bad bits. And she'd never really realised that there was this world out there. And, you know, just up the road was a major city, and there was lots of nice things to do and see. And, you know, there was more to life than the pub. Do you know what I mean? There was more to life than going to work, going to the pub, and that's your whole life. Do you know what I mean? But I remember we sat and we had dinner, and she apologized to me, and that's the only time she's ever sort of shown any recognition. She was like, I'm quite bitter. And I was like, bitter about what? And she said, like, I'm bitter about the way that I raised you. And then she just said, like, I'm sorry. And, you know, that was the last time I ever saw her.
Yeah, you have to take that. You have to take that, because I think that in those moments of clarity, she recognized what she was failing to do, and then that would make her feel even more guilty, which then would spiral into a circle of behavior that she'd always lived in. And it wasn't her fault. You know, she wasn't capable of delivering what she needed to deliver, and she recognized that, and she failed in that, and then that would have been a guilt that sat with her, and it just went on and on and on, around and around. So when she said sorry, that was the clarity. And in some respects, I'm going to say on my part, with how I feel it with my mum, but I think that it might resonate a little bit, is that they may have believed that exit in the world was their gift back to you through love, because the damage that they had done within those years that they'd been alive, what was that going to look like over the next 20 years? You know, if you think about your mum being alive now, you know, you're relatively, you know, in a good place. You know, yeah, you've had your ups and downs, but you've got 2 beautiful kids, you've got a beautiful wife, you've managed to attain for yourself something that you never thought possible 20 odd years ago. You know, you had a career in the Navy, you've got, as I say, 2 kids, you've got a car, you've got a house, you've got a wife, you have all the foundations of what you've been seeking. But would you have had that had your mum have been alive? And I'm not sure you would have, because like you, my mum was an emotional string that would just keep pulling me back, and I would be always going back to her, always protecting her, always fighting for her. I would never have been able to have lived the life that I'm living now with her alive. That doesn't mean I don't love her. You know, I love her with everything I've ever had. And I miss her, and I wish that she was here from time to time.
I speak to a friend of mine that's sort of similar in attitude towards trying to help people less fortunate. Do you know what I mean? And there's always a massive part of me that just thinks, God, if you just fucking held on a bit longer. Because my mum's problem was that she, you know, her whole plan in life, right from early doors, was that Prince Charming was going to come along and rescue her. Do you know what I mean? And that's why she went out with so many assholes. Because, you know,
You wanted the Cinderella ending.
Yeah, she wanted a Cinderella, but that was her plan in life. And it's like, listen, if you're a young girl and you think some man's going to come along and fucking rescue you, I'm telling you now, you're in for a rude awakening there. You know, and that's why it was abusive relationship after abusive relationship after. And there's always a part of me that just thinks, God, if you just held on, maybe it was me. Maybe I could have been the person to fucking drag you out of that shit that you were in, out of that attitude towards life that you had that, you know, really, she didn't see the bigger world.
you do have to look back at the time and the era in which they were born and the life that they lived. You have to learn from your mistakes. But I think some of the atrocities that they went through meant that they were traumatized, in such a manner that they couldn't come out of it, unless they had money and security and protection, which they had neither. They had no money. She had no safe house. She had no safe grounding. She had no family, no friends that she could rely on and be safe with. And being safe is the most important thing in life. You provide to your children safety and security at all times.
Was your mum safe? Do you think your mum was safe? Did she have that?
I think, listening to what you're saying, I think my mum had a little bit more stability around her than yours did. She had some good grounded friends, which meant that she had a bit more security and stability around her, which meant we in turn had that too. So even though there were moments when we were left vulnerable, and there were moments that she made decisions that weren't right and weren't the best, there were people around that had my mum's back in a community friendship way, that if, for instance, my mum, so, a bit like yours, she would leave us at home and go for a drink in the local pub or whatever. But it was a small community, really, and everybody knew her. And everybody would know me or my brother in that period in time. So there was only a phone call that I would need to make to say, whatever. So that was the difference, I think, in the fact that we did have that small thing. In the rare moments that I needed to call, not that I ever did, but she would call her family, there were one or two members that would be there at the end of the phone call.
That was
Your
obviously...
mum would be there at the end of the phone call, for instance, and one of her brothers would be on the other end of the phone call.
And that was obviously, there was some conversations before we did this, and I remember her brother,
and I'm beginning to remember now that they weren't the things I remembered last week, but I'm beginning to remember them again now. I think because obviously on the other side of with my dad's side of the family, I've had some neutral groundings. I think I'm able to perceive things slightly differently. That doesn't mean to say Mark perceives them in the same way, because we have different viewpoints, but in my mind, I see the vulnerability in our parents, and a lot of my frustration and anger isn't now, or never really was on my mum. I never had too much disappointment and frustration, but I was never too angry, and because I take it back to her parents, because it was on her parents to make her have a safe space. It's on the parents to make sure your children are safe and secure and have what they need, and they didn't do that, but to such an atrocity that it meant that they weren't capable when they left into the adult world to do it. Luckily, you've turned that around, and I've abstained from children, and other members of the family have turned that around when they've gone on and had children. So the cycle doesn't continue.
Do you think your mum's relationships had any bearing on your relationship?
Yeah, because I've never tolerated any of the relationships that my mum's had. I don't tolerate that behavior and that communication, and there's a lot of vulnerabilities. Whether that's the way that I've gone the way I have, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question specifically, but I just know that I refused to accept those things back then.
I'm going to sort of start wrapping it up. It's been a very deep conversation. Blame. Yeah. That's a big part. So the last few things I've got is blame.
I don't blame my mum. I blame parents is what I blame. Parental guidance and structure in a place that should have been safe.
So we're not naming, but I've already mentioned it. The example they got for motherhood from their mum was awful.
Yeah.
And
that's where the blame goes. It's straight there. It's like if you need to look back
not just with them two, but that whole family. And when we talk about the trauma that was going on that they've all had to live with, a lot of that is on one person who isn't here anymore. But I know that you've got a lot of blame towards them. I know I don't. Even though I had a relationship with that person until right near the end. But yeah, I've never shied away from the fact that they set a terrible, terrible example. Very selfish person. But actually, I do blame my mum, like 100%. 100%. I put everything, the decision to take her own life, 100% I put on her.
I mean, you can blame your mum for that, but do you blame your mum with anger and hatred, or do you blame your mum with kindness and understanding?
No, I don't blame her with hatred. I don't hate her. But anger, yeah, I do blame it. I think it was a very selfish thing to do. I think that the repercussions for what she did, they didn't ruin my life, obviously, because I'm doing all right, but they've left me with a heavy, heavy burden to carry. And I don't suffer with depression, but there's times where when I pause, when I start being thoughtful, if you like, right, the gravity of everything that's happened and the load that I have to carry, it's heavy. It's a heavy, heavy load to carry. It's a heavy burden to carry. The fact that I didn't speak about it for 17 years, do you know what I mean, should tell, because I talk about fucking anything, mate, do you know what I mean? There's nothing really off limits. Yeah, everything, and I talk about, and I've always been like that, but that was the one thing that I closed off on, do you know what I mean? And it was a lot to carry around on my own kind of thing. And I do blame her for that. I do blame her for taking away a bit of my happiness, if you like, do you know what I mean? Because I was always, even though I'd had a pretty rough upbringing through my mum's behaviour.
But then don't you think that she's gave you a different gift?
No, not really. No, I don't know. I know what you mean. It could have been worse if she'd been around. Like, maybe.
I'm not saying it would have been worse. I can only talk about my instances and what I think with my mum. And I think that in a way
we process things differently. And this is why I was saying you seem to have things together.
But that's just on the outside. I suffer internally.
I'm an angrier human being than you.
You're an angry human being. But I suffer internally with different things. I would suffer with confidence and intruder syndrome, and I have lots of other anxiety issues that people don't see.
The last thing that I was going to say is, do you suffer with any suicidal thoughts? Do you ever get depressed?
Suicidal?
Yeah.
No. Suicidal? No. Intruder syndrome, severely.
What's intruder syndrome? Do you mean imposter syndrome?
Imposter syndrome, intruder syndrome. Yeah, where you don't believe that you should be where you are. It doesn't matter how hard you work. You just don't believe that you should be there. You're walking around amongst people. Doesn't matter what you've got or how hard you've worked. You just don't believe that you're entitled to it. And that confidence. Talking. Anxiety. You have it. It's for me, probably like some other people, it's more internalized as opposed to external. So you don't see it or hear it necessarily, but it's there.
No, I think I'm the opposite.
You're the opposite. See, when I see your Facebook post, and that's not a bad thing because you're letting it all out. Whereas I suppose with me,
I've always, I'm a bit of an extrovert.
I'm an introvert.
I was drama club. I was, singing and dancing through school. I was always, like the Joker. I've always been the class clown. Andy used to have me dancing in front of his friends like Michael Jackson and stuff. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, no bother at all. I'm very comfortable doing these kind of things. And there's part of me that's like, I should be doing more than this. You know what I mean? Like, if you hadn't have done this, you hadn't have done that, I would
that's
be.
That's where your anger comes from.
Yeah, maybe, I do. That's probably something that I suffer with. I suffer with anger issues and resentment and stuff. But by and large, I'm doing all right. And I would just on that subject.
You're doing really well.
I never get suicidal thoughts ever. If anything, I get angry about the fact that I have to die. It winds me up because I've got so much that I think that needs
a long time to go first.
It's weird that there's a little clique of us, me, you, the two cousins we've been talking about, seem to have just stopped that behavior in its tracks kind of thing so that it doesn't pass down. This is the first time in 22 years that I've ever been able to sit down and have this conversation with anyone about it. So thank you for that.
That's right. Thank you.
I did originally, I was looking for people. And I don't know why your name didn't pop into my head, but I suppose that's almost.
Maybe you don't want to encroach.
Well, I just hadn't thought of it. I don't know whether that's like almost sort of replicating like the generation above us in that they're not close with each other. Do you know what I mean? There's something easier about not having to deal with.
When you're dealing with external people, you're talking about other people's problems, other people's history. When you're talking about ours, as much as it's my mum or whatever, it brings it to the same. It's the same. The ending's the same and the beginning's the same. It's just the middle that's slightly different.